Excited to be here. MIT, what a great brand, what a great company. I'm here to really talk about micromobility, which is a new idea. You probably have seen these scooters around, and you may have seen some e-bikes, and you may have seen some shared vehicles of all kinds. But in order to really discuss the opportunity and think about the future of transportation and mobility in general, we really should go back in time and understand how these things evolved long ago. And the reason that's important is because the history gives us an idea about timing. It's the question of how fast things go. Whereas some things are slow and some things are fast, the question today, and I think when you saw a lot of the introduction, a lot of the technologies being proposed, the really salient question for both engineers and business people is how long this will take, how do we allocate capital? So of course, to go back in time enough, I need to really go back in time, and actually I'm going to go back to 1450. That was the year when the printing press was invented. It was invented in Mainz, Germany. There you see it as a red dot on the map. And it was the only place in the world where you could get this technology. And over time, we saw more and more places adopting these technologies. So if you look forward a little bit, 20 years, you'll see how many more cities in Europe had this technology. And if you start to measure this, this is called the rate of diffusion, or the rate of adoption of technologies. And you see over time how many more cities adopted. And as one city obtained the technology, the residents in that city had access to printed materials. And this goes all the way through. The last year here is 1500. So this is a 60-year time period, or sorry, 50-year time period, 1450 to 1500. And during that time, the technology diffused to all of the Europe that mattered. In fact, we can draw a curve that shows the rate of adoption of printing presses, and you can see the classic S curve starting to shape up. This is for the whole continent of Europe. And you can do so for each individual country, and you'll see who is the fastest. Actually, it turned out to be Italy was the fastest to adopt the printing press, and you can see which countries were laggards and which countries were mainstream. So a lot of the analysis we think about in terms of technology adoptions, we can go back, way back in time. So actually, the printing press was a pretty fast adoption cycle, even by today's standards. One interesting anecdote is during this period, you might remember, Columbus went to America, and that was in 1492. And at that time, a lot of technologies also propagated to the New World, and many ideas came from the old world to the new world, from the New World to the old world. And I'm actually in the process right now to measure how quickly the technologies from the New World were adopted in Europe. And some of these ideas, for example, are surprising. One of the things I'm measuring are the adoption of tomatoes versus tobacco. Surprisingly, tomatoes took 300 years to adopt. A lot slower than the printing press. Why? So let's go back now to, or rather forward to 1800 and look at the technologies of the early 19th century. And this is what was going on back then. We had the telegram, we had railroads, and we had something called primary school education. This means going to school as a requirement. And you can see how many people, as a percentage in the United States, for example, adopted this idea. So we're talking about printing presses in the 1400s. We're talking about tomatoes a century later. And here we are in 19th century looking at schools. And what's interesting is as you follow these technologies and you see the rate of growth, some of these start off slowly and take off. And what I did in this analysis is I sort of looked back throughout the 19th century and tried to track what was fast and what was slow. What is the rule that determines whether something is fast and something is slow? Going back again hundreds of years, is there a pattern? Is there a logic as to why these things happen? Or is it simply circumstances, maybe leadership, maybe individual acting on their own? So we have the railroads, and by the way, in the United States, you have periods when things actually declined. Surprisingly, you have these dips in adoption. What happened there? This is 1861-62. Anybody know? Civil War. Wait a minute. So actually, wars affect technology adoptions. What else could it be? Could it be, for example, disease? Could it be pathogens? Could it be economic depression? And when you start to look again through history, you see these obvious dips where everything sort of takes a hit. So the railroad, you can see here the late 19th century, the takeoff of the railroad in the United States, steamships all the way up here, newspapers. Newspapers are an amazing technology, and you can see how many cities in the United States had a newspaper by this time, already in the late 19th century. And education, by the way, you see already has reached 87% by the middle of the 19th century, 1850s. And then we had, of course, the magic of the 20th century. And I'm going to have to zoom out to see this. And now you have amazing new ideas, communications in the form of telephony. You have electrification. You have electric motors, which actually changed industry dramatically. And you have new forms of transport, including internal combustion. And then you had a lot of consumer technologies. And the 19th century wasn't about consumer technologies. They're all infrastructures. One of the things about the 19th century, there are two examples where maybe we see some consumerization happening. The first is the sewing machine. That was something that actually diffused into households. And the second was the bicycle, which was a first mode of personal transportation. And the bicycle happened before the car. 1880s was this boom period for bicycles in the United States and then later in the world. And so what we see is clearly the 20th century, more and more of these technologies are becoming personal technologies. And as a result, we have a lot more data, and these things become really, really, really rich. And now you're seeing the 20th century. Obviously, I don't have time to go through this. There's over 140 diffusions here on this graph. And you can see not only introduction of new technologies, but much more rapid uptakes. So you have here 1800 till the present, almost 200 years of technologies. So what does this teach us? One of the things, by the way, is that you can synthesize these very messy, sometimes jagged graphs into a much smoother graph with a simple function. It's called the logistic function. It actually is a simple formulation with 3 parameters that allows us to sort of look at this thing with parameters alone and understand better maybe what's happening. So that's what I did. And you know, when I looked at all of these, and you can see slight variance here in terms of the graphs, and I can scrub through these very quickly and see how things actually do speed up towards the end here, towards the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century. And so continuing the analysis is sort of like, let's look at the whole century. And you can actually also make these sort of almost look like lines by taking the penetration figure, dividing by 1 over penetration, and you get it on a log scale, you get something that looks more like a line. Or visually, it's easier for us to perceive what's happening instead of these S-curves. But what I wanted to do is take that sort of analysis and then frame it over a long period of time and help us to understand the basis of adoption. And here I put this on the graph, again, starting at about 1900 until the present. So this is about 1 century of adoptions. And every vertical line you see on this graph is an year. So this is, you can see quite a lot of years here. And I did another step. I overlaid on top of that these green horizontal bars. And what these are the life expectancies of people born in those years. So every vertical line has a bar starting at that moment and going until the expected life of that person in that year. So that's the top there. So the year of birth is the beginning, and then you have the life expectancy of that individual. That's life expectancy at birth, by the way. And you'll see some interesting observations. One is this giant dip that occurred here in life expectancy in the early part of the 20th century. And if you follow the beginning of that bar, you'll see that it corresponds to the year 1918. So 1918, there was a huge drop in life expectancy. And also, you can see there's quite a bit of jaggedness to life expectancy in the early part of the 20th century. And of course, what that represents is not World War I, but the flu epidemic that followed immediately afterwards, where a lot of young people died. In today's world, that would account for a few 100 million people dying. So it was a very, very traumatic and very bad period. But you can see also how, over time, the jaggedness smoothed out. And again, this is sort of more of an analysis of other things affecting human life, human behavior. And you see jagged and sort of variable lines there. But then I started to think about personally more about my life, and I began to say, hey, I'm one of these people who exists in being born in the 20th century, so I put myself here as well, and that's this multicolored line you see, and that represents my year of birth, which is 1968, and it's actually color-coded to different parts of my life. So the first segment is childhood, the second segment is adolescence or teenage years. The third, which is yellow, is my education or higher education, my university years. And then the orange area is my working life. And that's kind of everyone's segmentation in terms of their lifespans. We all kind of have the same exact durations. We have the same childhood periods, the same adolescent period, and the same. These are sort of biologically indexed. It's how our brains developed, is how we end up doing education, and no one's quite figured out how to get a 4-year education in 2 years, and so we really can't compress this very much. If anything, we're actually trying to stretch things out and make them longer. And so obviously we want to extend life and the duration of our lives, but that's again, a biological question. Why does this matter is because I wanted to study technologies, but I said, well, what happened to these interesting lines that occurred in my life? What happened to the trajectory of, let's say, the microwave oven, the personal computer, the internet? What these things happened, at what moment in my life did they intersect my life? And I did this only to be able to calibrate and understand better what's happening. So let's clean up a little bit the clutter there and look at this graph more clearly. And I also extended it out so that you can see that the dates here go to 2074. So from the present, 2019, there are no other lines on there because, well, most of these things haven't been invented yet. So it would be nice to fill in this blank area. We have a lot of lines in the history. We don't have a lot of lines in the future. And so one of the things in these types of discussions that I have is like, what do people want to draw? What do you think will be drawn next? How fast is it going to be? Is it an important line or is it a trivial line? So the thing about these lines is another observation I made was that, well, actually we didn't know that these lines would come even only a few years before they did. So we didn't know about the smartphone in 2000. We didn't know about the smartphone in 2005, and it came 2 years later. I was at Nokia at the time, and although some of us predicted it would happen, there was no consensus within the company, and certainly not outside the company, that there would be something called a smartphone growing into a phenomenon that it became. We thought we would have these voice phones with text messaging for quite a long time. And so the problem was that convincing people, even when you see a weak amount of data, or some data, but it's not quite a proof that it's going to happen. So now we all debate, and we see candidates always being presented. We hear about artificial intelligence, machine learning. We hear about cryptocurrencies. We hear about, as we did this morning, fantastic breakthrough technologies. But how fast are they going to be adopted? And I'm particularly interested in transportation technologies because they're going to affect the way the planet ends up being transformed. And that's the question in my mind. And I've been thinking about automotive technologies for many years after I started looking at this. And I want to use a little bit of a lens of this automotive technology to dig into this. Let me just look at these graphs here at the bottom, which actually represent some of these core technologies. And you'll see here the radio, the washing machine, the refrigerator, the TV, the dryer, air conditioner. These are classic, iconic consumer technologies, all of them born in the 20th century. And what I drew with these horizontal bars is roughly their life expectancy in terms of when they were born, when they started maturing, when they started becoming very lucrative and very successful, sort of like what was their earning period And then when did they saturate, and therefore when did they become commoditized? So in many ways, technologies, if you look at them in this type of graph, is, yes, they're lines, but they represent segments of lifespans. And these segments are very, sort of iconically defined by the great work by Geoffrey Moore, who actually coined the crossing of the chasm, and he built on work prior that defined the diffusion of innovations. Rogers comes to mind, who said that we have early adopters, laggards, and we have mainstream. And so I thought, why not do this and actually color code these technologies the way I color coded my life? So you can see these technologies having a sort of an early period when it's sort of 0 to 2%, and that's very early actually, and then you have 2 to 2.5% to about 17% is when you have the early adoption, and then so on. You build up these sections. And the last is the laggards, who are adopting at the end in the purple zone. So you can do this for any technology, all these 140 technologies, and plot them and see how they intersect with human lives, especially those who were the adopters of the 20th century, and you see them again represented with horizontal bars there. So there's an overlap, right? There's this sort of the technology life, and then there's a human life at that moment in time. What's interesting also, again, it depends on the set you select, but this particular set, you can see how lifespans for technologies are shrinking. Why? Because things are born, and then they mature very quickly, and then they die very quickly because everyone's adopting things and everyone's commoditizing things very quickly. These might become obsolete, but mostly it's because we've just ran out of growth opportunities, and so the businesses die. And the technologies stay around, but the businesses related to them die. And so it's relevant because, again, if you were in the PC business and you saw the smartphone coming, you'd say, well, I still have 30 years to go, but in fact, you may only have 5. And then you're in the smartphone business, and it's like 2010, and you're saying, this is the greatest business on earth. How much time do I have left? Is it another 15 years, another 20 years? No, maybe it's another 5. Again, it all depends on how fast these things mature. And so you're dealing either with a fruit fly as an organism, or you're dealing with an elephant as an organism. Which one do you want as a pet? And so in many ways, what we do is we constantly are thinking about this. We're all constantly making decisions whether we want to deploy this technology, adopt this technology, invest in technology, whether you're a business that actually wants to participate, join an ecosystem. All these decisions are constantly in the top of our heads. We just need to quantify them a little bit better. And the metric for quantification in this case I'm using is the human lifespan. Again, remember, I do live in this time period. And there's my life again, as you can see now stretched out vertically with color. So you can see where this vertical line is a little bit old. It's 2015, but here it is in 2017. And you see how it's progressing. This time, the present, is progressing forward through my expected lifespan. It's sort of a little bit depressing, by the way, because it sort of tells me that my life ends in 2038. That's the end of the red area. And sort of, on one hand, I'm a little bit nervous. I've got a lot to do between then and now. And I'd like to still understand what will be happening during my life. And by the way, you can see, if I were an early adopter, these are the times when I would have gotten these technologies. If I was a late adopter, these are the times when I would obtain these technologies. But I'm sorry, oops. I did a little thing here where I kind of played a game where I changed my lifespan. Did you see that? The reason is that you can actually go online and type data about yourself in a calculator, an online calculator, and it gives you your expected life from now, not from your birth year. And given, if you take care of yourself, if you don't smoke and so on, you can expect a longer life. And actually, this gave me as a probability of about 25% that I would live to age 96. And that gave me a little bit more of this red area to live into. And so the final days will come later. So for 1968 man, this is what it looks like. So we're sort of in the middle of it now. And the good news is I'll live longer, probably. The bad news is that I've got more time to fill with lines, and I understand and analyze what's going to happen because I have to invest for my future, because you see that red area, that is retirement. And that retirement is suddenly a lot longer than we expected. It's not just for me, it's for everyone here. And our expectation to retire at age 65 means that we have to provide for a lot longer. And we also still have to provide for those early years in terms of what our children need to be educated and taken care of during those early years. And so here we are in this time frame. And by the way, I just thought, okay, that's my life. I'm analyzing the technologies which entered my life in the first 50 years. Now let's look at technologies, and understand how they affected the previous generation. So a close relative is my grandmother, who was born in 1913, as it turns out. So she lived through the whole 20th century and actually observed a lot of these technologies entering into her life, and her testimony, her comments about what was happening to her during these adoption periods was fascinating to me, as well, of course, as my own testimony to understand how we as individuals adopt technologies. And so I was very, very gratified to have a relative, and I encourage you to also take their testimony and understand how technologies were adopted early on by your relatives. But this is 1913, and by the way, I can also think about the next close relative, which is my son, who was born in 2005, and sort of try to calibrate maybe what technologies will affect him. The interesting thing is that if my grandmother actually did live to age 96, and if my son does the same, then the analysis period between my grandmother and my son is about 200 years. They overlapped a little bit in the middle there. And so 200 years becomes like your immediate family frame of reference. Like, what did my grandparents do, and what will my children live into? And sort of like you say, okay, I have oral testimony about these things. I can understand, I say to business leaders, I say, well, this is the minimum time frames that you should be analyzing. 100 years ago and then 100 years into the future, because at least, you may be, not so caring about the world, but you certainly do care about your children. So you do have to sort of think about them, and since you have evidence in the form of data, at least for your grandparents, you should be asking them what happened 100 years ago. And this is, to me, this is a tiny amount of money, a tiny amount of time to look at. It's 200 years. So when you do that, when you start to understand what was going on in these time periods, you can apply this lens, this framework, this analysis to industries. And this is a graph that shows for the automotive industry. I said I am curious about this industry, but this is what the automotive industry kind of looked like early on. This is the birth of the car industry, and I'm going to just zoom in here. This is the period from 1886 was, by the way, when the car was invented, also in Germany. This is the Benz Motorwagen. So the very first instance was then. And then you see this is the number of companies that were created in the United States. This is the company creation graph. So how many car companies were born? And then the blue line is actually how many car companies died in that year. So this is a huge amount of turnover. You had over 3,000 car firms born in the world between these 30 years. And that dotted line represents the moment when it hit 10% adoption in the United States. And that happened because of the Ford Model T, which established the production system that we still use today, the Ford production system. And when that happened, and the Model T took off, the number of firms born declined. There was sort of a mass extinction event for automotive firms. And so after the 1920s, there were hardly any new car companies. And you can see that's the lifespan of the auto industry in terms of those two dotted lines. That was when it hit 10% and when it hit 90%. Again, trying to frame the time scales here. And then this is the adoption curve for automotive in the United States. This is the production data, how many cars were built. Again, the firm creation, adoption, and units of production, these are quantities that are very closely related. And you can put this aside and do the same thing as an exercise for the next big thing that happened was a personal computer. That's the adoption rate of the personal computer in the United States. This is the number of firms actually supplying the industry. And then this is the production data for PCs, actually the sales data for the PC. Very similar interlocking relationships. And finally, we can do the same thing for smartphones. Again, a generation later, we have the adoption and the production data for smartphones, and you just see how much steeper that is. So I did this as a sample to kind of get an idea, and here's my life, by the way, back to my life, and you can see how the personal computer perfectly fitted my career time. So there's the time when I'm working, especially in the early years. If I was smart, I would have picked the PC or the computer industry in general to study in university, and I did. I actually chose computer science to study in 1985, and sure enough, rode the way forward. The problem was that by the time of the mid-career, that industry began to collapse because the growth disappeared. And so as a member of this generation, I have sort of the half-life of my career is sort of the industry half-life. And so problem is what to do next if you're in that cohort. Whereas the previous generation, this is the baby boomer generation, this is their lifespans. If they had been part of the automotive ecosystem, not just making cars, but everything to do with cars, their careers and their life, they would be retired by the time of the last big recession, and so they would have, if they survived, they would have made it through pretty much okay with the one job. And so that leaves us with this question of what about the next generation? What you're seeing where the smartphone, if you studied, let's say, making apps in college, if that was such a thing, but let's assume that you were focused on that, you would have only a few years before that industry peaked and began to be transformed and disrupted. And so the problem for this generation is that things are happening way too fast. And as you saw with the data, generally all things are much faster today. And so that is the framework. And I wanted to just now quickly switch gears to look at the future. This is the framework. I've been saying this for a few years. This is how to think about 100 years before and 100 years after today. And you can calibrate what technologies are going to emerge. And so what I wanted to do is actually talk about this new idea of micromobility. And where I began is not just in the data about how many people use cars, but how many people live in cities, because cities are actually a much more interesting area to study. And so when I look and sort of randomly select here any of these countries, I can actually probably find here Poland, and I could sort of, I'm going to pick it on the map. It's easier. Let's do that. By the way, so these are all the countries in the world, and I can just scroll through from 1950 until roughly the present. This is 18. Each of these bubbles represents a country, and blue means below 50% urban, yellow means above 50% urban, and you can see how they all rise, and the bubble gets bigger as the populations increase. And so this is the world today, and this is the world as it used to be, and you can see indeed from the last few decades how many more people joined the urban world. And when you go forward, and the data is available from the UN, this is not very controversial, very simple projections, you can see how most countries will be urban. And that's important because urban travel is different than rural travel. By the way, here you have your China, India, and actually I think I can touch Poland. Here it is. And that's Poland today, or actually, sorry, in 2050, and it's at about 70%. And you see how much it's expected to grow from roughly 2020, which is around 60% today, and where it used to be in 1950. And so we can do this for all the countries. It's not a big deal. Boiling this all together, oh yeah, and again, you can look at this on a map and you can see again the same thing. All the dots changing represent switching from rural countries to urban countries. So we can visualize all this, we can quantify all this, and we can understand better. But as a result, the global population is going to reach 6.7 billion people, but this is just urban population. Again, I'm only giving this as background data. This is one of the things you might want to analyze when you're thinking about mobility and you're thinking about transportation, right? What do you measure? You can measure demographics, you can measure aging, you can measure income. But what about measuring where people live? Because that seems to be relevant to transportation. And so when I did this analysis, I said, how fast are we getting to a population of 7 billion urban residents? And the answer is about 30 years, which is one generation. And 30 years, again, out of 200 isn't a long time. And so when I start to look at this and say, okay, remember that graph, let's break it by regions. So these are, for example, low income, middle income, high income. Again, United Nations data, urban versus rural. You can see the changes occurring. The yellow areas represent growth from now until the near future, until 2050. And so where's the big growth coming? Middle income countries. Some are going to move away from rural into urban environments. There will be a slight decline in rural residents in the high-income countries and a slight increase as well. But the major changes are coming in from medium and low income. So not only are we going to have 2.5 billion new urban residents, most of them are going to be in middle and low income. So if you start to think, oh, whoa, these are huge numbers. How are these people going to move around? How are they going to live? Where are the apartments going to come from? Where are the cars going to come from? Where are the parking spaces going to come from? Then it starts to look really interesting. Would you start to add up and say, okay, let's look at the exact existing mobility solution, which is automotive solutions in most cases, and we can actually measure the fleet. How many cars are there in the world? And this is data from, let's say, 2005. Again, I'm going to zoom in here a little bit, to 1980. And you can go back and, we can go back and then look at these from 2005. So let's go to present. That's 2000, the closest is 2018. So there's about 1 billion cars in use in the world, in urban environment today, and that includes trucks and buses and things like that. And there's about 400 million in rural. So altogether, right, this is the global car fleet. Altogether, it's about 1.4 billion vehicles. And if we were to motorize the future the way we've motorized the past, what we end up with is this number of cars and vehicles by 2050. In fact, we're going to be adding over 1.5 billion. So we actually end up with 3 billion vehicles altogether worldwide. The urban car fleet, 2 billion, and the rural car fleet, about 860 million. Here's the problem that I see, besides the environment, besides having to cope with, you know, what are the raw materials we need to deploy this many new vehicles, is that because cars are stored most of the time, 96% of the time, cars are not being driven. Because of that, every car needs to have an allocation of space. And at least each car needs to have a space at home, typically a space at the office, and typically a space in a shopping area. And so we just as a rough estimate, the US is actually worse. In some cities of the United States, there are 8 parking spots for every car that exists. And so, in fact, one of these offenders is Los Angeles. If you add up all the parking spaces in Los Angeles, that is the area that you would cover. It would be much bigger than Santa Monica overall, and bigger than Pasadena. This is all urban land that's being allocated to the car and saying, that's your home for the car has a home. This is where we're going to store you. And so when you start to look at this and ask, just a minute, so you're telling me there's another 2.5 billion people moving into urban environments where land is expensive, where everything is much more dense. We need to actually build apartments, and we need to build storage for cars. The economics are daunting. It's actually hundreds of trillions of dollars of real estate that are being demanded. So I'm not going to say that to serve the future urban population is going to cause environmental disaster. I think that goes without saying. The point is that it's actually unaffordable in terms of real estate. And so micromobility then becomes one of a discussion of real estate as much as it is about mobility. And that's the bad news. The bad news is we've got to solve this problem. The good news is that actually it is solvable. And I want to give you a quick introduction to the market for miles, which is the amount of distance we travel. Aviation, so here's a quick setup. There's 52 cards I'm going to represent the transportation market with, because there's 52 trillion kilometers being consumed today by people in vehicles. So that is divisible into aviation, rail, which is 4 cars, 4 trillion kilometers, buses, which are about 10, motorcycles, which are about 3, mopeds included, and the rest is all cars. So 27 cars, or 27 trillion kilometers, are delivered by cars today. And the thing about them is that you can also sub-segment them by distance traveled. So what this represents is if you were to create a histogram where the horizontal axis is bins 5 miles wide. So this is the first 5 miles, 0 to 5, are represented by 4 automotive cars, and then the next bin, 4, then the next bin 5, and then 3 and 2 and 2. And so the distribution of miles is heavily weighted towards the low end. We think about distributions being normal. In this case, they're log normal, meaning that they're logarithmically more likely to be short. And when you understand this, you say, wow, wait a minute, that means we can easily bundle short trips and deliver them in a different way. Right now, all these trips, all the way to hundreds of kilometers, are delivered by one vehicle type, which is the car. And it's designed to be more and more powerful. It's got more range, it's got more energy in it, it's got more, even if it's electric, it's got more capacity. It has seats for 7 people sometimes, 5 at least. It has cargo capacity, and it's hardly ever used. All these excess quantities are underused. And you have essentially occupancy of about 1.2 people per car. And they're driven mostly short distances, the most common, again, being between 5 and 10 miles. And so I said, this is an opportunity so that we can break the car problem into smaller pieces that we can deliver with new technologies. Here, for example, just the actual data. This is New York City taxi trips. The most common distance is 1.5 miles. If you were to, and by the way, you can actually approximate it with the log normal function. This is what it looks like purely as a mathematical function. So it's pretty consistent. Here's the US data for car trips. Again, I use those cards as a metaphor, but you can see the actual data here. And again, you can see how it looks as a log normal approximation. So we can quantify it, again, very easily. And once you do that, once you do have a distribution, you can start to summarize things. For example, what if we look at everything less than 30 miles and we put everything above 30 over there in one bin, and it starts to look like this. Okay, so very long trips, that's pretty big. But what does this mean when you try to bin things more closely? You start to bundle things. And this is again, 0 to 5 approximations. And what I did is I went all the way to 2 bins only. And that's the number of trips in the United States under 25 and above 25. And you can see actually how short distance is the majority here. And you can do that for vehicle miles traveled. You can do that for person miles traveled. You can do that for revenues. So where money is spent is in short trips, predominantly, almost 2 to 1 in short trips versus very long trips. Or you can do it by time and say how much time is being spent given the speed that people go. It's like, holy cow, this was a real breakthrough for me, understanding that the distribution looks like this. And so now we have population, we have a demand for new solutions, and now we have potentially an observation that really the demand for trips is short, not long. In urban environments, more so. And so the solutions that we're seeing emerging right now, and I used the word micromobility for the first time only 2 years ago, in the summer of 2017. And we've had a huge change in the world since then. We've had billions of dollars invested, hundreds of, I would say, companies created. And we've had, in fact, we can get into how many trips, we'll do that in a minute. But just to give you an idea, when you look at the profiles of the types of vehicles that are being launched, so e-bikes and scooters, you see their distributions right now, the way they're being used. This is in Austin, Texas. And you can see a similar pattern emerging as far as how they're used, although, again, the distances involved are much shorter than that for the car. In fact, what I did is you can actually take the car data, which I sort of compressed a little bit here vertically, and we can overlay on top of that all the micromobility data. So here we have scooters, which are the shortest distances, bikes, which are the next one. Then you have e-bikes, which are a little bit further out. And that yellow one is sort of e-mopeds. These are sit-down vehicles with a throttle that sort of simulate motorcycles. And you can see how they start to be further out, much closer to where the car is, which is the stepped line below there. And so what what this represented to me is sort of, again, the data coming in after only 1 year is that micromobility solutions are effectively overlaying with the car at the right part of the spectrum. They're used for very short trips, and they're done so in a dynamic way, which means that they're on demand and they're shared. And so what this lets me do, again, going back to the analysis in the beginning about timeframes, what this lets me do is calibrate how quickly this is going to happen. Because what we're seeing is a product market fit. We're seeing where the demand is, and we're seeing where the solution is. The car guys are not interested in this part of the spectrum. They're interested in the high end. They're interested in bigger vehicles that go further and faster. Even Tesla, that is an innovator in many ways, is actually always trying to deliver even more range to its customers. Whereas scooters are satisfied with 15-mile range or less, or 15 kilometers, as the case may be. And so as a result, what we're seeing is a tremendous adoption curve. This is the cumulative number of rides taken on on-demand mobility solutions. The yellow line, that's very smooth and long, is starting at the same time frame, by the same time, calibrated to start at the same time. That's Uber. Yellow is Uber, green is Lime, and by the way, those companies both just went public after roughly operating for 10 years. So they're at the 10 billion trips delivered mark. By the way, that's a log scale on the vertical axis. But the two lines I want you to focus on are these blue and yellow ones, which are Bird and Lime. Bird and Lime are the newcomers in shared mobility with scooters. And they've been giving us a few numbers in the last year. And by the way, again, because they're indexed at the same time, you can sort of see who's growing fastest. So we think about shared mobility and saying, fantastic story, although maybe not yet profitable. We don't know how it is going to really play out, but it's sort of generated shareholder value. Now we're seeing a shared micromobility. And those numbers are, roughly speaking, 4 times faster. So the question is, how quickly will they reach the top of this graph, which happens to be 1 trillion trips? And since each trip is 1 trillion miles approximately, it's like flipping 2 of those cards that I showed you earlier. And if we can flip those cards from cars to micromobility, we actually are going to make an impact on the environment. And how quickly will that happen? If you follow this trajectory, you'll see that it's possible within 5 years. The only problem is that these new modes of transport are creating their own demand. They're not yet substituting. People who are riding these bikes or scooters are actually taking trips they wouldn't have taken otherwise. So maybe this is additive to the burden of the planet, but that's been always the case. The new technologies, even every one of those S-curves, was creating its own demand. Only over time did they obsolete a predecessor. Peak horse in the United States was 1920s. When the population of horses reached its peak, not 1860 when the car was invented. Oh, sorry, 1886 when the car was invented. So we had 30, 40 years of the ascent of the automobile before the horse was displaced. But the faster it goes, the faster the obsolescence happens. So I'm super excited. I'm actually, first time in Warsaw here, and I saw scooters everywhere. And I'm very, very excited about that technology. It is essentially a smartphone on wheels. And the smartphone went from 0 to 3 billion people using them in a decade. So I think we can achieve this transformation. It's not the end of the car. The car still has the long distance trips to handle, but it might reduce the impact on the environment, and it also reduce the impact on the space that we allocate to them. So thank you very much.